What's up? In this video, I'll show you how to create this three-dimensional audio visualizer in Blender. We're going to be using geometry nodes so we can edit and manipulate our mesh according to the audio. It's going to be super fun and really rewarding. Let's get started. Alright, so I've just opened up Blender and I'm going to start by clicking and dragging to select everything that's existing in the viewport and press X to delete it. So I've got nothing. So I'm going to press N to pull up my view, and I'm going to turn up the clipping end in my view to something like 10,000 so that my scene doesn't disappear when I zoom really far out. And then I'm going to right away just change my output location to my folder of where I'll be saving. I'll just get our settings ready for our animation. So I'll select the output location for my folder. We want to export an animation with audio, so I'll change it from PNG to FFmpeg video. Then we expand encoding and scroll down, and we want to include our audio codec to AAC. And all of the AAC settings are fine, but I'll change the video output quality to perceptually lossless. Also, before we import any audio, let's change our frame rate up to 30 FPS. Do that before we import audio so it doesn't mess with the timing of our animation. And now we've got our output location set and the correct settings, we can begin to add geometry. So I'll change over to the geometry nodes workspace, and in this lower panel is where our nodes will be in our geometry node editor, but we can't add anything with Shift A until we have some geometry to work with. So up in our 3D viewport, let's press Shift A to add a plane. So now there's a plane up there, and now we can add a new geometry node modifier. So when we click this, it also appears in our modifier stack. You can see it's this geometry node modifier as if we added it from here as well. So we added that plane just so we could get this set of nodes. We're actually going to use a grid instead. So I press Shift A to search, or even Shift A S and then type grid, and click and drop that right in place of our plane, and we can delete the group input. We've got our grid now in our viewport, and if we change over to wireframe view, we can actually see the vertices change as I increase the count. And in geometry nodes, when you have sliders, you can click and drag down across multiple, and then drag left and right, and you can change all of the sliders that you've highlighted. For this video, I want to make the size of my grid 16, and the vertice count about 45. So essentially this will be a flat ground map that we're going to use to place our geometry on at all of these little intersection points. So we have this geometry node set up. I'm actually going to make a second. I'm going to add a modifier and another geometry nodes tree. So here I'll click New, and I have another group input, and we're going to be using a tool called Instance on Points to take a piece of geometry and place it on all of the points on that existing grid. So I'll search for an instance on points and place that in our group input, and everything disappears because now it's looking for those points. There's no geometry. So I'm going to Shift A to search for a cube, and I've got that. I'll plug my mesh into my instance, and as soon as we do, it's now placing a cube on every single point that we had on that grid. And the cubes are overlapping because they're too large. So if we click and drag like before across the size to change it all at once, and then hold Shift so it's a smoother movement, we can scale them down and rotate, and our objects aren't intersecting anymore. So according to that first grid that we created here and the number of vertices, you can see we can go back and tweak what those cubes are actually doing as they're mapped in our other geometry node tree here. And it's really as simple as that. This geometry node tree can be used to create an audio visual, because all you have to do is bake the sound wave into any of these transformations, which is really easy to do in Blender. So to set up our workspace for animating, I'm going to right click on the header to create another horizontal split down below, and this will be my timeline so that I can scrub through the time of the animation. And then I'll be changing this over to my graph editor. I'll increase the end of my animation because I know the audio will be really long. So just as a quick example, it's as simple as this. If I hover over the scale with my mouse and I press I on the keyboard, it inserts a scale keyframe for this object at keyframe 1 where I'm at. So I've got that instance on points selected, I've got the keyframe, and I go over to my graph editor. Make sure your object is selected, the array of cubes here. And now you can see that it's inserted that keyframe, and we want to bake sound into this curve. Right now it's moving at a flat elevation, a flat scale, nothing's changing, but we're going to use audio to modify that curve. So we go key, bake sound to F curves. Select your audio, and you can actually choose the frequency of your audio here. So lowest frequency 0, and maybe let's only set this to the base, like something like 500 as the maximum frequency. And then I'll reduce my attack time. And that's good, I'll keep the other settings. So bake sound to F curve. You can see it immediately disappeared because over here at our graph editor, the scale is actually going below 0 here. 0, and then the audio starts to affect it when the song begins. So this is actually mapping the scale in X, Y, and Z, these different colors, accordingly to the audio. You can see it goes through the entire song. The song continues for ways past. So if I increase the end of my animation, I can just see where the end of the audio is here at this X, all the way there. So it's 5,000 frames if I were to animate this entire animation. But you can see when I scrub through it, it's already affecting the scale as I get to the... So if I press play, you don't hear anything. And because we need to go to the little plus sign on the top and add a sound. So we're going to be video editing. Make sure you're back at the 0 keyframe and add sound. All the settings are okay. So now we've got sound baked into Blender. Go back to my geometry nodes layout. I've got my timeline down here, and if I press play, it's cool, but it's kind of chaotic and we can make it look a lot better. So you can see we have this waveform and we can modify it. So if we select X, Y, or Z, or all of them while holding Shift, we can add a modifier over on this side panel, add modifier and envelope. We add a control point, we can then really change the dynamics of how big these pieces actually get, the extremes of what they go to. So keep in mind what we've done here is only directly influence the scale with audio, which sometimes doesn't really produce the result that we want. So let's do something a little bit more complex. So I'm going to right click on my instance on points to clear all keyframes. And you can see they disappeared from the graph editor. We still have our sound if I press play, but we don't have any keyframes baked in geometry. Let's do it in a new way. I'm going to Shift A in our Geometry Nodes editor to add a noise texture. And then I'll Shift A to add a map range. So the noise texture will add a bunch of randomness, and then the map range will let us control the minimum and maximum values of that randomness. Now we can plug that into our scale, and you can see it's random, and if I tweak the from min and from max levels, the objects will either go down to 0 or negative, or get really large to a maximum. Noise texture is 3D right now, but if we change it to 4D, it gives us this W. W basically is the texture coordinate, or the location of where it's mapping the noise. So if you slide W, it just randomly changes the noise and how it's being calculated. An easy way to animate this is animating the W with music. So I could hover over my W and press I. My keyframe is at 0. I've got my noise texture selected and my object selected. E. bake sound to F curves. Choose my song, and this time, let's choose a higher frequency. Let's start at something like 10,000 as a maximum to something like 20,000. So we're getting a different sound now incorporated into our noise texture. And when I press play, nothing happens because we zoom in and we can see that noise texture is really small. So this is where we could use that envelope modifier. I've got it selected, add modifier, envelope, and if I add a control point, now I can change that variance, that noise. So it'll get really wild when the song gets more higher volume. So now the sound is randomly influencing the location of where that noise texture is being made. You want to make it more dynamic? It's as simple as taking your result from your map range and plug it into your rotation as well. Now as you scrub through, the cubes will be randomly rotated according to that same texture. Let's make this look a little bit cooler. I'm going to be adding a displace modifier to the overall grid. So I'll go add modifier, displace. I'm going to click and drag and place it between the two geometry nodes groups. I'll press new, and then this little button over here, show texture and texture tab. Image or movie, change it to clouds. And I want my displace modifier to be affected by an invisible object. So I'm up in my 3D viewport, I'm going to shift A to add an empty plane axis. So this just adds an invisible axis right in the center. I go back to my modifiers, change my coordinates to object, and then I want to map that texture to that empty. Now if I select my empty and move it, it manipulates that displacement, change the mapping of that displacement as well. So this is another type of movement that we could map to a different frequency of the song then. One way to keep a steady movement of this object would be to make this plane axis follow a circle around in our field. So I could shift A to add a curve, circle, and S to scale it up to about there. Doesn't really matter. So to make our empty follow that curve, we select the empty, either in the 3D viewport over here in your manager, empty, add object constraint, follow path. And then we select our target, which will be our Bezier circle. Now if we change the offset, it moves that axis around the curve. So this offset could be animated to music then. So you would see more offset happening at certain points in the music. As simple as hovering over offset, press I. We're at keyframe 0, keep in mind. I've got the plane axis selected, offset, go to key in my graph editor, bake sound to F curves. Bake. Now, there isn't much movement happening yet, but if we add an envelope modifier, and we add that control point, drag it up and down, that movement is going to be a lot more noticeable now. So our plane axis will start moving back and forth really once it gets to this point, but you can see it's already jiggling in space. Alright, so that looks kind of cool. Maybe it's a little too chaotic. We can reduce that control point and bring it back down. Now how would we render this scene? To set the scene up, I'm actually going to use two 3D viewports. So I'm going to change my graph editor over to my 3D viewport. Here I'm going to be adding two lights. I'll press Shift A to add a light, an area light, G to grab and click the mouse wheel to move it up on the Z axis. Click, G to grab and mouse wheel to the left. Now I'm going to look from the front with number 1 on the number pad and R to rotate. You can see that line is pointing towards my object. And now I'll press S to scale and I'll just click. You can see it started that scale function, and I'll grab my Y and stretch my light out to this full width, even farther than the object. So it'll be a really long horizontal light. Looking perfectly from the front with number 1, I'm going to Shift D to duplicate the light, and R to rotate it. And then these two lights are going to be different colors. So you select the light, go to the light properties, and click on the color. So I might make this red, and I might make this one blue. Nothing's happening because if we change over to our rendered view, the first thing we're going to need to do is change our render engine. So from Eevee to cycles, because I'll be rendering this project in cycles. And then our lights don't have much power, so we click on the light, go to light properties, and increase it to something like 1,000, or maybe even more, maybe something like 4,000. Now you can see we've got this cool lighting on our scene. And now we need to look at our scene through a camera. So before I add a camera, I'll press 1 on the keyboard to look straight, because it'll be adding a camera when I press Shift A for parallel with my view. So now it's perfectly facing forward, and I'll move it back. G to grab, just like any other object. Looking from the side, I'll rotate the view down. So now I'm just going to keep this as my camera view. I'm going to press 0 on the number pad to look through my camera. And now I'm going to change the focal length. I'll probably zoom in a lot, and then press N on the keypad and go to View and check Camera to View. So now as I scroll with the scroll wheel, I'm actually controlling the location of the camera. So I'll scroll out. And something that'll help you align your view is if you go to Camera, Viewport Display, and then Composition Guides. And you go to Thirds, Center, Diagonal. Maybe all of them aren't necessary. But you can really line up your 3D model then perfectly with your viewport. There we go. And then I'll press N on the keyboard to uncheck Camera to View so that I can leave the camera in that location. Now when I zoom in and out, I'm not affecting the location of the camera, I'm just zooming in on the photo that I'll be rendering. If you want to change the overall background of your scene, you can go to your world properties and change the color. I've got mine at black. But something I also prefer to add, sometimes there will be weird noise in the background if your camera renders something into infinity. So I'll often add a background. I'll add a big cube in the background of my scene. As an easy way to create this, I tab into edit mode and I press 3 on my numbers to be able to go into face select mode and then select faces that I want to delete. So I click on this, faces. So now I've got this super simple little studio, and I'm going to add a bevel modifier to round it out. So I'll increase bevel a lot and segments. I'll just move this object back and scale it up accordingly. So now it has this cool gradient reaching across of my pink light shining across, and there's contrast with the blue light shining across as well. Easy way to get that effect. So we're not quite done yet. In Blender, you can keyframe just about anything to audio, even the power or color of your lights, for example. If I select a light, go over to my light properties, power, I can just hover over it and press I. Sure enough, I'm inserting a keyframe. You can see it was in the middle of the song. I'm going to press Ctrl Z and make sure I'm all the way back at the beginning. And now I'll press I when hovering over my keyframe. Go back to my graph editor. Bake sound to F curves. And it goes dark because it's according to the audio now. We need to increase that a bit. You can see by increasing that control point, increasing the power, light has to have a lot of power. It's at numbers like 10,000. You can see I'm just at 1,000 right now, so that's why I'm increasing this F curve so much. You can see now it's starting to have a nice glow. It's even flashing to the music. One last step, you can make this look a little bit more dynamic by animating the entire object. Go back to your start, select your object, and press I to insert a keyframe for rotation, for example. I've now inserted a keyframe there. I'll scrub forward in my timeline, press R, Z to rotate on the Z axis, and then type 360. Then I to insert that keyframe for rotation. So now we've told it to rotate 360 degrees in that amount of time. And it stops. An easy way to make this continue is select your object transformation. We don't need the Y rotation or the X rotation. We only care about Z. You can see it goes up to 360 and stops. So we're going to add a cycles modifier to just make that repetition. Now it keeps on going through the entire animation as long as we need it to. If you don't like the speed of your animation, it's as simple as selecting your keyframes and dragging them out in your timeline or in your graph editor. You can do additional things like even reduce the rotation, but I'll keep it right at that line at 360. Alright, and now you're set to go. Just make sure you change the end of your render to the end of your music as long as you'd like to go. Keep those samples down because this will take a very long time to render through an entire song. So keeping your samples and your light bounces down. For example, I'm going to go to my light paths and click and drag over all of them and press 1. So there's only one maximum bounce for all of my light paths since I'm using cycles as a ray tracing renderer. Now you're almost ready to set your final render. You just want to go change your sampling for your final render. Something like 400 might be suitable. And I choose denoise and I have optics selected using my graphics card. So you can see my render, max samples, only 400. And then I can go up to render and render animation. Alright, that concludes this video, but I assure you we are only scratching the surface. Take that grid setup and manipulate it on your own, add noise in different areas, animate different areas with audio, and see what kind of crazy results you can produce. It's really fun. I assure you I'll have lots of follow-up videos, and be sure to check out the full-length audio visuals on my channel that I created using this exact same process with a little tweaking at the end. You can get some really cool results. See you in the next one. Self-respect, when you out of line, you put yourself in check. They don't hear me, they don't hear me though. Cycles going round and round and round like a merry-go. Stand for truth, or fall for any old scenario. That's why I keep my circle smaller than a Cheerio. Cause it's the company you kick. Stay woke, please don't get caught slick. End up.